Welcome to Horror in Detail, the channel that takes you deep into the chilling heart of the woods, where shadows dance with fear and every rustle of leaves whispers a tale of terror. Prepare to embark on a journey through the darkest corners of the forest and dark woods. First story. There's something in the deep woods of northern Sweden. I went to a garage sale in my local town a few days ago. I live in Sweden, and so second-hand shops and car boot sales are very common, at least out in the countryside. Often I just end up browsing the stalls without really intending to buy anything. The one I visited a few days ago was in a village about a half-hour's drive from where I live. The second-hand store was just literally one room packed with all sorts of riffraff that should have been thrown away ages ago, rather than being sold for far more than it was worth. On my way out, something caught my eyes that I couldn't resist taking a closer look at. It was a history book about the local area, and because I'd recently moved here for work, I got curious and decided to buy it. Inside were a few loose papers, with handwritten notes which took some time to decipher due to the fading of the ink. I don't know who it belongs to, or if the story on the pages was even true, but I thought maybe you guys would be interested in hearing about it. Before I begin, I need to be honest with you. You see, the thing is that this story isn't mine to share, but I feel like I have to. I've spent too many years feeling guilt pressing against my chest, and if I don't tell you now, it'll go with me to my grave, and I'd like to leave this life with a clear conscience. Another thing you need to know is that I've changed some details, such as the names of those involved and place names, just to allow them some privacy. I apologize if I seem a little cryptic, and I don't mean to sound like one of those conspiracy theorists, but you'll understand. I promise. Some of you reading this might have kids of your own, or maybe you're still deciding whether or not parenthood is for you. I just want to tell you this. I am so sorry. Anyway, I guess I should start at the beginning. My name is unimportant, but to make it easier for you, let's just call me Edwin. Ever since I was a kid, I loved making up stories. By the time I started school and learned to write, it was almost impossible to make me stop. Back then there were no smartphones, computers or iPads or what have you. The only thing we had was good old pen and paper. Soon enough, Swedish became the subject I excelled in, and my grades were always high. One of my teachers used to say that I'd been born with the gift of words. I could look around me and transform my surroundings into fantastical adventures. It was a way for me to cope with the repetitiveness and mundane nature of daily life. To that end, I feel it's important for you to understand that I've never been a city person, and I'm not the only one. You see, my family come from northern Sweden, an area known locally as Tornedalen. When I say north, I mean way above the Arctic Circle, in the middle of literal nowhere, surrounded by forests and mountains. My old man grew up in a minuscule village in the northernmost part of Tornedalen, on either side of the rippling waters of Torna River and an hour's drive from Kiruna. Dad grew up in a small homestead with 4 older brothers and my late grandmother, who to this day is the kindest woman I've ever known. I never met my grandfather, as he passed away when Dad was 16 years old, and so my grandmother was forced to raise 5 boys all alone while running a small grocery store. There wasn't much Grandma couldn't handle, and God help anyone who dared challenge her. During the first few years of my life, I lived in that homestead with my family. I attended school in the local village and liked it well enough. If you've never lived in the countryside, it's almost impossible to convey the freedom of living so far away from the city. Summer months were spent exploring every single path, stream or hunting cabin with my friends. The eternal light from the midnight sun turned the whole world into our playground, and we stayed awake until we simply were too tired to keep our eyes open. In those days, parents didn't care as much about their kids' whereabouts, so long as you were home for supper. During the winter months, we used snowshoes to get around in the woods, which were now covered by a thick blanket of white powdery snow. If you were lucky and if it was cold enough, you might catch a glimpse of the green shimmer from the northern light dancing on the sky. I remember my grandmother once telling me that according to folklore, people believed the lights were souls dancing on their way to the afterlife. At some point in the 60s, Dad and I moved to Stockholm where there were better job opportunities. We both missed living in the north, and so every school holiday was spent in the small village by the river. We spend those holidays fishing, both ice and normal finishing, hiking trips and overnight stays in old hunting cabins. Some of my fondest memories from those days were when we followed old ski tracks, placed reindeer skins on the snow and then lay there for hours enjoying the warm sunlight of early spring. We often sat in comfortable silence, without feeling the need to say much, but sometimes just as the first colors of twilight appeared, Dad would tell me ghost stories, even though I was way too young. Summer holidays seemed endless and I often explored every single corner of the village with my old friends. Sometimes we'd set up tents in some secluded meadow and retell those ghost stories first shared by our parents. I wish I could tell you that I continued visiting the village in my teenage years, but with all the things brought on puberty and when I eventually started university the year I turned 19, I'd almost forgotten all about the little village up north. When it comes to my mom, there's not much to say. She's never been a part of my life and I learned early on that there was no point asking questions about her. My only memory of her is a vague scent of lavender which she used as perfume. If I'm completely honest, I'm not even sure I know her name. That's probably why Dad sounded so surprised when I offered to travel up for Easter during my second year at university. Even now, I'm not sure why I was so keen to go, but when I heard that my uncle hadn't been seen for a few days, I just knew something was wrong. Dad couldn't go because he was tied up with work and none of the other brothers had a particularly great relationship with my uncle, because they thought he was a little more eccentric than what was socially acceptable. In their defense, they weren't wrong, but they also rarely spoke about him, and just like with my mom, I learned to simply not ask questions. Uncle H was Dad's oldest brother who a few years ago, decided to move back to their childhood home. He'd grown tired of city life and missed the tranquility and silence of the far north. Dad always said that when you get older, you get this yearning to go back to your roots. Honestly, I can't remember a single Saturday morning when Uncle H didn't phone us to talk about the latest gossip in the village. Now, before I continue, I feel like I have to explain what winter is like in the north, because I honestly don't think you can understand it unless you've experienced it yourself. Imagine waking up in the morning and it's so eerily silent that not even the birds who sometimes stay over winter are awake. It is so bone-crushingly cold that when it hits you, it's as if thousands of sharp needles are piercing into your skin all at once. Not only can you see your breath, you can practically touch. Then there's sun, which doesn't rise until late in the day and only stays up for a couple of hours before making its all-too-quick descent behind the horizon. I began my journey on the day before Maundy Thursday, when I flew from my small university town to the north, where I met up with one of my childhood friends whose car I was borrowing to drive to the village. The moment I stepped in through the front door with its familiar squeaky hinges, my childhood memories instantly came flooding back. I could almost smell Gran's freshly baked breath and warm laughter echoing through the hallway. 2 empty coffee cups stood on the kitchen table and a half-eaten cinnamon bun, which is practically societal heresy in Sweden. Other than some dried reindeer meat, a loaf of bread and a half a liter of milk, the fridge was depressingly empty. Maybe Uncle H was in a rush somewhere and hadn't been able to buy groceries. It was still strange and not like him to tell anyone where he was headed. At that point, I realized it was both too late and too dark to go out and look for Uncle H. Not to mention nights were even more freezing than during the day, and to be completely honest, I had no idea where to begin my search. Besides, if I spent the next few days with the house as my base of operations, my first priority was to make sure I didn't freeze to death inside. I spent most of that evening cranking up the heat in the fireplace and making myself comfortable in the lounge. City life, I realized, had spoiled me with its modernities like electric heating, and the simplicity of life above the Arctic Circle was almost forgotten to me. Even though the house was a more than familiar part of my life, I still felt like a stranger here. An eerie feeling lingered in the air that I couldn't quite describe. The closest thing I can think of is that it felt as though I was trespassing. Maybe it was the general fatigue of the journey here, or my worry over Uncle H's disappearance catching up to me. To silence my worrying mind, I decided to plan what tomorrow would look like. Many of the families from my childhood still lived in the village, and I thought that perhaps one of them had seen my uncle over the past few days. An angry and hungry growl came from my stomach, and I quickly made a sandwich with smoked sausage, which I devoured with a glass of cold milk. I thanked my past self for packing an extra duvet in the car, because I was convinced that whatever bedding remained in the old wardrobes were covered in damp and likely partially eaten by moth larvae burying themselves into the fabric. Nevertheless, I made myself comfortable in the old sofa bed and finally began to feel more at peace as I stared into the fire, feeling myself being hypnotized by the hot glowing embers and dancing flames. Just before my eyelids became too heavy to stay open, I thought I heard a vague buzzing sound just outside, almost as if there were voices creating a melody traveling with the wind. I was awoken at 4 o'clock in the morning by the deafening bell of the grandfather clock in the kitchen. Cursing myself for forgetting its loudness, I decided there was no point in going back to sleep, so I made myself a cup of coffee and flicked through an old local newspaper. I'm not sure what made me look out the window, but I almost choked on the coffee when I saw a crouching silhouette on the edge of the forest, trudging through the snow towards the house. My heart began to race when I realized that I had nothing to defend myself with, and if I did, what was I going to do? It was only when the figure got closer to the house I recognized the more distinct features of the shape. It was my uncle. Without even putting on my shoes, I ran out to him. He was limping as though he had been injured, but he still carried a rifle in one hand, but his jacket was covered in blood. Even though he looked right at me, the look in his eyes was still distant. What the hell happened? I asked, but my uncle only muttered something in Finnish that I couldn't understand. There was no need for a doctor to tell me that he was in shock. "Come on," I said to him, "let's go inside." "What the hell, boy," he cursed, "what are you doing up here? Don't tell me your father sent you." I explained that when nobody had heard from him, Dad got worried and I offered to come up here. As soon as we got inside, I lit the stove to make more coffee and then recalled seeing half a bottle of vodka in the pantry, which I put on the table along with glass next to it, but my uncle drank directly from the bottle. A few moments later, I poured 2 cups of strong, black coffee, and for a while we just sat there in silence. I wondered if I should call an ambulance, but then my uncle told me what happened to me. Uncle H explained that he'd been visiting a relative on the other side of the river, and as per usual, it got a little later than planned. At some point in the middle of the night, he decided to make his way home through the woods like he so often did. Snowshoes made it easy to make his way across the massive amounts of snow covering the ground, and whatever alcohol remained in his system kept him warm. Even though my uncle had trekked through those woods ever since he was a little boy, a strong feeling of unease crept up his back and made the hairs stand on the back of his neck. By the light of the moon, he thought there were shadows moving towards him, accompanied by a strange buzzing sound in the wind. Then, he saw them. Dozens, if not hundreds of children whose faces were unnaturally pale and their eyes were entirely hollow. The creatures dragged themselves up from the snow and made the most unnatural sound my uncle had ever heard. It was deafening and heartbreaking all at the same time, and he was overcome by emotions that he could not name. A bony hand grabbed his ankle and another opened the mouth, which turned in a massive, gaping black hole. My uncle told me that he'd never run so fast in his life. Uncle H didn't say much the next day. Mostly, he just wondered how long I was planning to stay, and when I told him I'd be around for a few days, he seemed pleased that he wouldn't be alone over Easter. However, when I told him that I was going to call my dad to let him know everything was all right, my uncle made me swear to not recount what he told me. He said that it was probably for the better if it stayed between us, seeing as the rest of our family already thought of him as a little strange. I gave him my word, and so when Dad wondered what happened, I simply told him that my uncle got lost in the forest on his way home. Dad muttered something about stubborn old men, but didn't ask any more questions. After I hung up, I turned to my uncle, who sat by the kitchen table and stared out the window. My mouth hung open as I struggled to form the words, even though the questions were clear in my mind. "I know you don't believe me, boy," my uncle said, as if he'd read my mind. "But surely you've heard the stories. Those about people who get lost in the woods and never make it back because they've been taken by the miling." I wish I understood what he meant, but then a vague memory resurfaced somewhere in the back of my mind. Uncle H nodded at the chair and I sat down, nervous about what I was going to hear. A part of me didn't want to dismiss his experience, but I didn't believe in ghosts and ghouls. Then, he told me something that to this day, I wish I'd never heard. Asterisk asterisk. When Uncle H, Dad, and their brothers were younger, they often traveled to the neighboring village on Saturdays to attend barn dances. Sometimes, girls from larger cities would attend the dances, and if you were lucky, you might get a dance, a phone number, and a promise to meet again. That's where Dad saw her for the first time. Uncle H said that if there was ever a moment where he believed in love at first sight, that was it. He recalled exactly how the look in Dad's eyes changed, and when my uncle followed Dad's gaze, he noticed a girl he'd never seen there before. Her long, blonde and curly hair glimmered in the light, and she wore a green, knee-length dress. Uncle H thought she might have been there with some friends, but she was standing away from other girls as if she was avoiding them. After a while, Dad eventually plucked up the courage to speak with her, and when they danced, he was enchanted. Afterwards, everything happened so quickly, and the only thing Dad would talk about was his new love. Uncle H explained that he and the other brothers just assumed it was yet another crush that would fade like it always did, but this time they were wrong. Uncle H told me that my mother loved my father as much as he loved her, but she was carrying a terrible secret. In small communities like the ones up north, rumor spreads like wildfire. Keeping anything to yourself is pretty much impossible, and my mum knew she didn't have much time. Being pregnant with a child that wasn't my dad's and that was born in secret could make life incredibly difficult for a family. My dad would have struggled to find decent work with which he could support his new family. So, after the birth of my half-sibling, my mum knew what she had to do. It's not difficult to hike into the forest and bury a child so that nobody finds out about it. Women in these parts have been doing that for hundreds, if not thousands of years. Who knows how many unloved and illegitimate children are buried in the woods of the north? On the surface, my parents had a happy marriage, and a year after their wedding, I was born. According to my uncle, Dad had never been as happy as the first time he held me in his arms, just as enchanted as the first time he saw my mum. There was never any doubt that my mum loved me with her whole heart, but Uncle H also knew that she still carried with her the grief of burying her first child. You could see it in her eyes and how she sometimes stared out the window into the forest. One late winter's night, she never came home. My dad was hysterical and looked everywhere without any results. The whole village made a joint effort to find her, and after a few hours, a body was found in the woods. The strange thing was, instead of being frozen, it was almost completely charcoaled, as if it had been devoured by an unnatural fire. The worst part of it all, though, was the shape of what once had been a child in the body's arms. My dad never spoke about what happened. He never met another woman, even though Uncle H and the others told him to move on with his life, get married again and give me a chance to grow up with a mother. Dad refused and moved far away from the village in the north, to cities of the south, where he could hide his grief in the exhaust fumes and sweat from the ever-growing masses of the city. Far, far away from the woods of the north. I'm writing this down out of pure selfishness and to ease the burden that's been weighing on my heart for years. Most of you won't believe me, and that's fair enough, I suppose. My cousins remain blissfully ignorant of our family's secret. These days, they have kids and even grandkids. Sometimes, just like I did when I was younger, they spend school holidays in the village in the north. I can't help but wonder if sometimes, they might have heard that same melodic buzzing in the wind, just before going to bed at night. Second story. This story was shared by Lou/Itherasu. Devil in the Woods. I sit here in a dingy hotel, next to a dead town, my shotgun is loaded and I'm strapped with gasoline, ready to head back into battle. The one true battle I've been needing to fight. As I wait for nightfall, I want to tell you how I got here and why I need to do this. As a child of 14, I lived next to a large forest. It was a huge expanse of woods that contained the town in its green embrace. My house was on the outskirts of town and my backyard was extremely close to where the deep woods began. I would walk through there during the day often, exploring the trails with friends, or just playing near the edge of the yard. I never thought I would feel afraid of the forest. It had a strange vibe, like it held dark secrets, but that didn't alarm me when I was a child. My mum, however, was very afraid of what she witnessed. One day I came home from school very tired, so I immediately went upstairs intending to head to bed, forgetting to tell my parents I was home. When I reached the top of the stairs, I could hear what sounded like my mum having a full-blown breakdown in her bedroom. The door was hanging open just enough to peek through. I crept up to the door and looked through the crack. I saw my mum facing away from the door, sitting on the bed. My dad was next to her. She was weeping and shaking, and when she spoke with terror in her throat. It was truly hard to hear, but I could just about make out what she was saying. I saw something in the forest last night. I woke up dazed. It was late and outside our window, I could hear what sounded like gagging, a low deep guttural cough followed then by a loud sucking, slurping sound, like when you suck a straw to get the last drops left from a drink. I got to the window with the understanding that it was probably an animal choking on its food, so I looked out the window towards the forest. It took a while, but I eventually saw where the noise was coming from. I could see a rough figure crouching low, then two small glowing red lights in the darkness. They were not moving, so I assumed it could have been an object reflecting light from the moon. It was only until I saw them blink that I noticed they were eyes, and they were looking right at me. That did shake me up a bit, but the horror sank in when the creature started to come out of the woods crawling on all fours onto our lawn. It was heading straight for our porch doors below. Its goal was to get inside our house. I was going to wake you, but the creature stopped crawling and then started walking. It was huge. It must have been at least 7 feet tall and was bony, so bony, like a walking skeleton. It walked slowly to not make much noise. At this point, all I could make out was a shadow. I wished it would have stayed that way, but when the thing got close to the doors, the back door light sprang online, lighting up the whole backyard, including this lumbering monstrosity. I caught maybe 2 seconds in total before it sprinted back into the forest. What I saw was unspeakably horrific. It had a nasty inhuman face. It was like a skull, and its eyes were just black circles with red pupils. It had a huge set of exposed teeth that looked like daggers, no lips, just teeth, and there must have been 50 tooths top and bottom to complete its mouth. A gray, wrinkly, hairless skin was covering its bones, like a plastic wrapper. It raised its huge arms quickly to shield its face from the light and ran into the darkness of the forest. Last night I struggled to sleep, but when I did, it was invaded by horrible nightmares of this creature, its dead, blank gray face with its nasty exposed teeth, watching our house with malicious intentions, waiting for a good time to strike. This morning when I woke up, I went straight out into the garden to check if anything was left behind, so I could prove to you it was real, and what I found made my head spin. The light that sprang to life has a nasty big crack over the screen, which I'm sure is new. Luckily the light still worked, but barely. My father is a scientific guy and doesn't believe in things like the paranormal or monsters. He prefers rational thinking, and to him these things were virtually impossible to comprehend. Sarah, you probably just had a bad dream. Remember you used to tell me you had them a lot as a child. Maybe it was just that. He said that with confidence, like he had just rationalized the impossible. She shot him a stern look and fired back a response. I never used to dream up monsters, and I've never dreamed up something so vivid. She was then cut off abruptly. I accidentally moved the door forward with my knee, causing them both to turn with speed and shock. My father immediately sighed when he saw me. Andy, by God you scared us. When did you get home? I lied to them and said just a minute ago. They both looked at each other, pleased that I may have not overheard their hidden chat. My father turned to my mother and quickly said, "Let's talk later in bed. We don't want Andy overhearing this. It might scare him." Truth be told, I was terrified already and regretted overhearing the nightmarish story. I did end up heading to my room after, but I couldn't sleep in the end and I was no longer tired. Thoughts plagued my mind all day. Could Mum be telling the truth? Surely such a horrid creature didn't exist. I had to find out for myself if this creature was real. I waited until the dead of night and crept downstairs towards the back doors. To my surprise, my mother was already there, peering outside. She was awfully pale. I said in a quiet voice as I came down the stairs, "Mum, what are you doing up?" I startled her by saying this. She turned around to face me. From her facial expression, I could tell she was angry. "Andy," she said in one of those loud but hushed tones, just enough to let anger out but not enough to wake anyone. "I could ask you the same thing." She said it in an urgent voice this time. I looked at her with regret and guilt on my face. "I overheard your story, Mom. I came home earlier than I said and heard pretty much the whole thing. Surely that thing you saw isn't real, right?" "It can't be," I said, but I knew the truth. I could tell by the terror in my mother's voice when she told the story that she had seen something nasty. "You shouldn't have. It was an adult conversation and you are too young to hear those things. Now go back to bed." I outright refused and she was shocked at my rudeness. I told her I would feel better if I stood with her and see for myself if it was real, otherwise I'd be up all night. She sighed heavily and said fine. I walked next to her while she was looking out from the glass doors into the deep forest beyond our lawn. We watched all night together but nothing appeared and we both went to bed feeling a little easier, that the thing may have just been a dream after all. A few days passed at this point and though the story stuck at the back of my mind, I started to play outside on the lawn out back and even walked the trail with my friend a few times. I felt at ease with it all, and lived on. Then my world flipped back upside down and the freedom was soon taken back from me. It was a beautiful summer evening, the sun was just setting and we had people over for a big barbecue. I mostly played with friends outside all evening. It was so peaceful. My mother and father had just finished cleaning up and told me to come back inside as it was getting dark. I asked for just 10 more minutes as I was practicing kick-ups and was so close to getting 100 in a row. They agreed and went back inside. They would normally close the doors to stop flies from getting in, but this time, my mother insisted the door was left open just in case. I heard rustling from a nearby bush behind me and it caused me to stop going for my goal. My heart was beating fast and visions of this monster flooded my mind but like a curious naive child, I walked towards it. On the floor just beyond the brush was a dead carcass. It was mangled by something brutally. It was laying on its side, its face was smashed in and its guts were spewed over the forest floor like red ribbons. It looked like a scene from an animal documentary where the predator had tucked into its prey and shredded them to pieces. Everything you could see was red with blood. I stood and stared until something extremely strong grabbed my ankle and pulled. I screamed bloody murder instantly and I was dragged with force through the bush in front of me. All I could see was undergrowth and I could feel it shredding my clothes and skin like cheese on a grater. I could hear shouting in the background and an awful scream, followed by a horrid guttural snarl. I had just come out the other end of the bush, when to my surprise the thing had let go. I could finally see the vivid, peaceful sky again. Sitting up and looking straight ahead I could see what dragged me running off into the forest and Mum was right, it was a horrid creature, absolutely massive, gray, and extremely bony like it was anorexic. It was running on all fours like a panther and before I knew it, it disappeared, into the darkness of the forest. The background noise that I heard earlier was from my parents and they came over immediately to help me back up off the damp woodland floor. My mother immediately grabbed me and held me close to her. She moved back for a second to assess the damage I had taken. It was funny because at the moment I couldn't feel anything, but when I looked in the mirror after the incident, the cuts, scrapes, and bruises were quite shocking. However, there was nothing more painful than the mark on my ankle where the thing had grabbed me. It was completely swollen and extremely hard to walk on. Suffice to say she was shocked and started crying at the state of me. She then hugged me close again and I heard her say in my dazed state to my dad, "Did you see that thing, Fred? I told you it was real." She said with serious panic in her voice. "I did, but it just looked like an animal to me, maybe a large bear. I don't know, but it was something big." Doubt started to creep into his rational thinking. "Oh come on, it grabbed our child with such force it dragged him through this massive bush, how can an animal do that?" She couldn't believe that he was doubting her still. "There are animals that can," he said with a deflated ego, and with that, we headed inside, shaken and afraid of what was to come from all this. Weeks went by again, this time with more fear than the last and the thought stronger. I barely went outside and I certainly avoided that damn forest. I stayed off school for a few days to let my wounds heal. On the bus home from school when I recovered, my friend Ted asked me if I wanted to walk the trail after school. It was a lovely day, but of course, I refused. However, my friend had already made up his mind as he was going to walk the trail still, even if it meant doing it on his own. He had done this quite a few times, so to him this would be nothing out of the normal, but he did not realize that the forest was changing. It had released something extremely dangerous. I warned him immediately about what I saw and what happened to me, but I fear this just piqued his interest and wanted to go on a hunt for it. To all my best efforts I failed to dissuade him, and he did go that evening out onto the trail. He never came back, and the guilt I still feel to this day eats me up inside. I should have agreed, maybe we stood a chance together, but fear was controlling me and there was no way in hell I was going to step back into that forest. I told Mum straight away where he was going when I got home from school, but his bus dropped him off quite a few minutes before my stop, so when she called his parents had already said he has already headed out. It's weird because I and Mum looked at each other after that call like we had just been given the news that a loved one had died. I can only imagine what could have befallen him when he walked the trail for the last time. That night was tough. The guilt I felt was so strong that it was impossible to sleep. What made it worse was it sounded like Ted was calling my name from outside. I lay there, thinking I was dreaming, but it continued and I realized this wasn't a horrible dream, it was a real voice. It cried, "Please Andy, I'm scared, let me in, why did you not come with me, I'm so scared." I was frozen in bed as I listened to this strange voice that sounded like Ted's, but it sounded off like something was replicating his voice. It was belittling me, stabbing the knife of guilt further into my soul. With great hardship I eventually gained the courage to look outside my window, to see if it was him. I cried at what I saw. I may have even soiled myself in pure fear. Ted was there, but only his head, as the creature was holding it in his hand by the hair like a lantern. It was truly grotesque. The sight of it alone is something that will plague even the strongest of men for eternity. To my sheer horror, it spoke to me through Ted's voice. I could see its massive set of teeth moving slightly to show it talking. After the mocking finished, it spoke, in a low growl of a voice, "We will meet again soon, young one, I'm sure you'll taste delicious," as he did, drooling everywhere as it spoke. I winced in pain as my ankle started to hurt again. It felt like it was on fire, and it caused me to bend down and lift my pajama bottoms to see what was happening. Everything looked normal aside from a large hand mark from the creature when it grabbed me, but that should be gone soon. It soon stopped quickly after examining it. I immediately looked out the window again, but this time there was nothing to greet me back, just an empty street, fast asleep for the night. Safe to say that night I didn't sleep. How could you when seeing such a sight? For the rest of the night, I laid awake thinking about the creature and what it said. "We will meet again soon, young one, I'm sure you'll taste delicious," as he did. Its haunting voice echoed in my brain. After a full night of thinking I concluded, "Light, it's afraid of it." I thought about the time it tried to break into our house when it saw Mum. It ran from the light. It tried to break it on the same night to get in, but the light still just about worked, in the end, saving us. I told Mum the information the next day, and she also agreed it had to be light. That meant in the day we were safe, but at night we would need to be on guard, especially after what it told me the night before. Mum had an idea of keeping the hallway lights on at night and just in case carrying flashlights on us to use if it did end up getting close. There was a knock at the door, and Mum answered. It was Ted's parents, and they looked worse for wear. Ted's mum spoke in a very distraught voice, and the guilt crawled up my body and tugged at my heartstrings. "Hi Sarah, sorry to bother you. Have you or your son seen Ted by any chance? I noticed you called yesterday to check up on him. He walked the trail as I said on the phone, but he never came back." She started to cry at this point. I would have no idea what to say in this situation, but Mum must have thought about a response beforehand. I'm so sorry, Carol. No, we haven't seen Ted lately. I called because Andy changed his mind about going on the trail with him and wanted to see if he could come. I wanted to see if Ted had left so he could join him and they could go together. It was a great response, executed perfectly, and saved us from looking like crazy people if we told them the truth. Some things are just better left unsaid, even though it hurt like a bitch to hear such a cruel lie. I see. Well, please, if you do see him, tell him to come home straight away, she said with heart. Of course, Carol. Have you called the asterisk? I stopped listening here as they started one of those adult conversations. This time I avoided it. The night was approaching fast and we all prepared for sleep, leaving the hallway lights on, to which Dad protested, but Mum gave him the glare, which normally meant move along before you start something you can't finish. Mum tucked me in tonight, which comforted me, gave me a large flashlight, and I placed it down on the bed next to me. As she was tucking me in, she said, "I've spoken to Dad. I've told him I want to move. I don't feel safe here anymore, and I'm sure you feel the same. It's wrong. You should feel safe, and I won't have it much longer, so we're looking to move as soon as possible." I was quite shocked at what she said. I have lived here all my life, and a change like that for a child is extremely overwhelming, but I also felt relief that this nightmare might finally end. "Well, anyway, good night, sweet boy. I hope you sleep well." "Night, Mum." The door was left ajar to let some light fill the room. It was comforting, and soon I fell into a deep sleep at last. Sleep didn't last too long, and when I woke it was pitch black, like I had woken up in a cave of nightmares. My ankle started to throb again violently, but that did not disturb me compared to the fact that the hallway light that was on before I went to sleep was now off. My room, which was lit before sleep from the hallway, was now engulfed in darkness. I yelled for Mum immediately, but to my growing despair, she didn't respond. Then my despair jumped off a cliff when I heard the floorboards creaking downstairs, followed by a slow, soft creaking going up the staircase. I was stunned with fear. I could do nothing. My body and mind were all frozen in terror. I knew it was the monster, and it must have found a way into the house, but most of the lights were on. How would that even be possible? I tried to turn on my bedside lamp, but it wouldn't. I checked the plug quickly to see if it was in, and it was. I then realized it must have turned off the power. Honestly, I could have just curled up and cried at this point, but the fear was just too strong. I had to do something. By the time I was ready to act, it was already upon me. I heard the creaking stop, my heart pounding now as the bony gray hand wrapped around the door as to open it. The fingers were ghastly long, as were the nails that supported them, thick like daggers, and you could see dried blood covering them. "Go away, I'm warning you," I said it meekly as a child would, gripping the flashlight now as the thing came through into the room, and it was grinning with pure pleasure, teeth gleaming in the small stream of moonlight coming from the window, drool dripping all over the floor. "You're mine this time, child. You escaped me once, but not this time. No one is here to save you. You children are always the tastiest morsels." Thoughts then flooded my mind of poor Ted walking that trail, loving life unknown to him that he would soon become this thing's prey. This pissed me off, and everything I did after was for Ted. I boomed. I said, "Go away." I grabbed my flashlight with everything I had, clicking the button and pointing it straight at the thing. It didn't work at first, and the thing dashed towards me hissing in anger. I thought I was going to die, so I shut my eyes, but with one final click, the flashlight finally burst to life, covering this beast with beautiful light. It instantly felt the effects and threw up its disgusting arms to shield itself from the glowing brilliance of the light. With that I ran straight out of my room and to my parents' room, screaming and shouting all the way. They woke immediately, both shocked at the chaos. My dad shot up, grabbing his pistol nearby instantly. He did not question me this time and went into the hallway. I stood next to Mum completely dazed in fear. I hated this night, truly this had to be the worst night of my life. My dad screamed at me and Mum. Run! The thing was now running out the bedroom and into the hallway at full speed at Dad, hands raised, claws out, and ready for battle. My dad raised the pistol and unloaded everything. All I could hear was the bangs, loud and fast, followed by a scream. I still hear that scream in my dreams, waking me up at night like a terrible joke of an alarm clock. Sad to say, I blacked out for the rest of the night. Fear gripped me too strongly. The next thing I knew, I was in the hospital, confused and incredibly scared, but next to me was Mum sleeping silently in a chair next to me. Like she sensed my awakeness, she bolted from her slumber and ran to my bedside, crying with happiness. "Andy, my sweet boy, you're awake at last." She grabbed my head and held it close to her. "Mum, where am I? What happened?" "We was attacked." She began to recite what happened last night. To my absolute dismay, I hated books that ended with "it was all a dream," but at this moment I seriously wished that was the ending. I'm sad to say it is not. "Dad is dead, Andy. He saved us." I wished he believed us sooner. She burst into tears. My ears rang for a moment, then I tuned back in and looked back at her. The words just slipped out from here. "No, no. That can't be. He's so strong, he would have been able to beat it. Mum must have gotten word from the police that proved he was dead, otherwise she would have agreed." "He's gone, son. I know it's hard to accept, but he is. Listen, we're going to get out of here as soon as possible and go to stay with your auntie. We're not safe here anymore, and I can't stand another minute of this town." She said that last bit with spite. I didn't understand that at first, but later in life, she told me it was because the police did not believe her story and chalked it up to a home invader. They had similar deaths in the area like Dad, and they thought it was linked to a possible serial killer. Years went by and the suicide attempts racked up. I never did end up accepting what happened as Mum wanted me to. The time I hit 18, I was completely lost, outcast with no friends or prospects. I was not religious, but I prayed night after night for relief, and to my surprise one day it was answered. 1 week away from the end of college, I attended a job fair as a last-ditch effort for guidance, and to my surprise, I found it, the Army, and they were recruiting then and there. I spoke to one of the guys who sympathized with my story. I left out the whole monster part and said it like the police had, saving me from the shame. From there, time went fast. 3 months in, I was training. Then before I knew it, I was deployed and deep into Afghan territory, and to my relief, around our base was nothing but yellow glorious sand. The guys hated it, but to me, it was heaven, as there wasn't a fucking forest in sight. My prayers felt like they had finally been answered. I had a direction, a purpose, and in a twisted way, even though my life was actively in the line daily, I felt safe. I was finally far away from that thing, and from here I grew in strength again. To my surprise, on one of the days at the base, I received mail, which was normal from my mother but not my aunt. My heart sank when I saw it was from her. I knew something was up, and I was right. It was a very emotional letter, but the statement was that my mother had gone missing. She was walking home from work as usual to my aunt's. She was last seen next to the woods, and I fucking knew that thing had got her. God knows how, but I knew. I knew somehow it got her. I felt lost again, but this time I was pissed. A couple more months went by and I was shipped back home. The boys were scared after what we saw. Death, destruction, but no, for me it didn't faze me in the slightest. There are more disturbing entities than war, and I had seen one of them. Back to the homeland we sailed, and when we got back it was time to disperse back to our family for some much-needed R&R. My aunt cried when she saw me and hugged me close. I felt emotionless, half expecting my mum to pop out as a surprise, but no, just my aunt, but at least it was someone. I asked her what she knew about Mum's disappearance. We sat drinking near her warm fireplace while she elaborated. "It's my fault, I should have written to you sooner. Your mother had been acting very strange leading up to the disappearance. She said she heard voices and saw things, but I could not confirm myself. She was saying the forest was calling out to her, that the beast was waiting, ready to strike at a moment's chance. The night before the event, she claimed it got into this very house and tried to kill her, scratching at the walls and doors like a wild beast. I was out at the time and again I saw little evidence to support what she was saying. Then that fatal night she went to work like usual, but she seemed different. She gave me a big hug and told me that she loved me and was so proud of her little sister. She has never said that before, and it took me back. I just shrugged it off to her having a good day, but I now realize she was saying goodbye. I checked my knife drawer to find one missing. If this thing is real, then she must have gone into the forest to fight it. The sadness I felt was immeasurable. She was crazy to do such a thing, but at the same time, it showed strength, and I now knew I had to do something. I gathered my things after she told me the story and left. My aunt begged me not to go and that the police would look into it, but I was fed up. I needed to do something. I grabbed the keys off the side of my aunt's car and promised her that I would give these back to her when I'm done, and with that, I left. I stopped off at a gun store and bought a combat shotgun with bullets and filled up tanks with gasoline. Then with speed and anger I headed back to that shitty town. So here I sit in this hotel waiting for nightfall, next to town which is pretty much deserted except for some hardcore locals. My shotgun is loaded, 2 flashlights at the ready with plenty of battery, knives, a combat jacket, and most importantly a few tanks of gasoline. Nightfall approaches. I hear a blood-curdling howl come from the woods near the hotel. The thing must know I'm here. I must end my story here. I will kill this thing even if it means sacrificing myself and setting that whole goddamn forest on fire. It ends here. Learn from this. Nature can be amazing and beautiful, it can also be deadly. Forests portray that contrast like no other. From afar they look breathtaking, but within, the silence, emptiness, and stillness hide the nightmares we fear. My name is Andy Thompson. I wish you all the luck in the world. Thank you for hearing my story. Goodbye. Third story. This story was shared by you/ewoods115. The woods are old, dark, and deep. Always bring the fae a tithe when you enter a forest. They're possessive, vicious things and won't hesitate to trick young women to get their way. You must never make a deal with the fae. If you must make a deal with them, it must be finite in time. My grandmother braided my hair and told myself and my 23 cousins these rules, and since then they've been burned in my brain. I couldn't wait to pass these rules on to my own children, and plant down our own roots in this land. If only my ex was on that same page with me. After my ex decided I couldn't give him what he wanted, I was left to start over and try to figure out what to do with my life when there was this large, empty hole in it. There may be hope on the horizon. I've hesitantly started dating again and met someone named David on an app my friend signed me up for. He seems so kind and focused. He's a very busy photographer, working in the southwestern PA film industry. We had been going on dates for a few weeks, and he offered to take me on a camping date for one night only. I would usually scoff at the idea of camping, but David was so persuasive. A former Eagle Scout that had a lot of camping experience, and when David picked me up, I lost my trepidation when I saw his bright smile and effervescent eyes. David had always looked at me so intensely, it felt like he had waited all this time to pick me. And it made me feel so good to be chosen. On a whim, Because we were going to an old-growth forest, I pocketed some quartz, iron and some honey too, as the Fae love sweet things. It's the harvest moon this weekend, and I thought that with a big moon out, we could both be a little bit more adventurous, David states, driving a bit recklessly up this mountain road. I felt my cheeks warm and couldn't keep myself from smiling as we finally arrived at the campsite, which to my surprise, had 3 people already setting up camp. I looked meaningfully at David, asking, "Do you know them, or?" David glanced over and nodded, "Yeah, they're friends from work who are really into camping, so I thought I'd invite backup." "Wait, backup? For what?" I ask. David smirks, and says, "You're not the first girl I've brought camping with me, these 3 just help me sort out which girl is, you know, a good fit." I arch a brow, decidedly less impressed by this reason. "So, this isn't your first time camping with a date?" David glanced back and dismissed me. "No, it's not." I looked at him for any further disclosure, which he ignored and continued unloading the car. "Well then, that's fine, I'll be the final girl in this impromptu test." I bit my tongue and grabbed my brand new camping backpack from the back of David's pristine car. I straightened up, and after seeing David wouldn't be introducing me to the 3 newcomers, I walked forward and stuck my hand out. "Hi, I'm Maggie, pleasure to meet you." The woman of the group looked down at the proffered hand in a nonplussed way, before placing her hand in mine and smiling brilliantly at me. "I'm Tippy, it is so lovely to meet the woman David's been going on and on about. This is my brother Rowan, and my boyfriend, Puck." I offered and shook both Puck and Rowan's hands, trying not to get flustered. These 3 were preternaturally beautiful. David was a photographer, and I wondered what these 3 were doing behind the camera, not in front of it. Rowan and Puck are both 5'10" to 6 feet, Puck with the most beautiful onyx skin I've ever seen in person, and what seemed to be scarification along his arm. Rowan has bright forest green eyes and freckles like a star map all over his face and upper chest. He was pulling on a shirt when I had approached, so I caught a peek of what looked to be beautiful tattoos weaving in and out and over his arms, back and chest. His honey blonde hair is pulled back in a low bun, making me break my own personal rule of never finding man buns attractive. On his right hand he wears a signet ring on his pinky, the gold glinting in the sunlight. Tippy shared Rowan's freckles, but her coloring was entirely different. Tippy had beautiful brown hair braided down her back, and she was the tallest of the 3. Possibly 6 feet 1 inch. She was lithe and moved with purpose. She had this soft, dreamy quality to her face, with this beautiful gap-toothed smile that lit up her face. Tippy and Rowan looked like each other when they smiled, and their movements mimicked one another. Puck gently takes my backpack from me and sets it down, with Rowan offering to help me set up a tent for the evening. David was nowhere in sight, so Rowan grinned conspiratorially at me and queried, "Mind if I help you then? Unless you know what to do." I grinned and said, "Did the price tags give me away?" I heard Tippy laugh, sounding bird-like and musical, before she looked at me again. "Oh, Magpie. I'm going to enjoy you." I tried to take it for the compliment it was meant to be and ignored the undertone of menace in her voice. David hovers and watches this, not offering to help, instead laughing when he said, "You weren't joking about how pathetic you are, darling." I bridled at how he just spoke to me, going to tell David so, until Rowan steps in and says, "You won't be speaking like that again on this trip, David." David looks back and pales considerably at Rowan's face, before nodding mutely. "Okay, I'm sorry, it's been famine times lately, and I'm just cranky. I'll be better tonight, right Rowan? Rowan didn't respond. Rowan was wonderfully easy to speak to. David clearly didn't know them as well as he thought, as his jokes never seemed to land. Puck and Rowan watch him strangely. Tippy was the one who suggested we start our hike up the mountain to see the rock formation that was the largest draw of this location, a beautiful quartz geode-like cave called Hataru, in Lenape. Before we left, I took out my iron ingot, quartz and little jar of honey and left them all in a corner by my tent. Puck sees this, grins and winks at me, before taking Tippy's hand and moving to lead the group. Rowan gently leads me into the middle of the group, explaining that since I had the least experience, I shouldn't try leading, or bringing up the rear. Especially until I was comfortable knowing the path. While walking to the cave, Tippy told us the legend associated with it. Her voice is musical and soft. She begins. Many years ago, a young Lenape couple were in love. The woman was the daughter of the shaman, and the man was a strong and capable warrior, who always fed his people. But both were betrothed to be married to another. The young woman, unable to believe she would lose her love forever, cried, and cried, and cried until the forest spirits heard her. This woman was most beautiful when she cried, and these sprites loved pretty things. They collected her tears and put them all over the cave, creating a hatasu. That's beautiful, and somewhat sad, I said. David laughed and brushed my arm, cajoling. You're too soft sometimes, babe, it's just a story. I pull a face at him, muttering, stories like that exist for a reason. I think it says something for them to have lasted as long as they do. It wasn't until we both quieted down that I noticed the whole forest went silent. As we continued walking up the trail, the size of the trees are truly overwhelming. The undergrowth and forest were so lush that barely any sun made it through the canopy. These woods are old, dark and deep. The cave mouth appeared from nowhere and was more beautiful than I had expected. There was a man-made sign in front and to the side of the cave. I understood why the Lenape created a story surrounding its creation as we stepped in. There was a plaque on the wall explaining the history of the cave, how it was a mine for a bit before the company shut it down at the request of the Lenape, and due to multiple mishaps that occurred when trying to establish the mine. Collapse, flood, all said the land refused to accept the mine. As we entered the cave mouth, Dave pulled his camera out and began flashing dozens of pictures. Not of me, though. More so of Tippy and Puck, who looked put out by his invasion of their private moment. It's then that I hear the camera start whirring, before it starts smoking and hissing. Odd. I arch a brow at David swearing up and down, bringing out his spare camera after that one is trashed. I'm a magpie by heart, and the beautiful crystalline walls take my breath away. My fingers itched to dig out a crystal from one of these walls to take back home with me. Rowan walked up and laughed at my yearning expression. Why not just take it? I paused before answering, as the question seemed to have a deeper meaning. I got the sense it was important to answer seriously. I don't know. After that whole story, and knowing these could be her tears, it feels like too much like stealing. My gut is telling me it's a great way to get cursed. Silly, right? A look flashed across Rowan's face, while he shook his head in the negative. No, it means you can practice some restraint. Taking them from the walls would be dangerous, you never know which one would trigger a collapse. He laughed as I snatched my hand away from the wall and paled significantly. But if it's on the ground, I imagine it's fair game. He bent down and picked up a quartz point roughly 6 inches long and handed it to me. I took the gift and smiled brightly. We settled on taking 6 crystals back, though he understood the monster he'd created when I began magpieing my way through scattered rocks along the ground. As we packed up to leave the cave, Rowan was honestly being a much more attentive date than David, which made my stomach turn a bit. Rowan noticed me staring at his tattoos, and explained each tattoo's meaning to me, his smile fully showing his slightly crooked teeth that he endeavored to keep concealed. It was the most human thing about him, that crooked smile. When we left the cave entrance, I fell in between Tippy and Rowan, with Tippy walking beside me. Tippy mentioned that it was a full harvest moon tonight. I asked, David mentioned that too. What's so important about the harvest moon? Tippy smiles faintly, responding, it's something to be experienced, not described. When you see it, you'll know. As I slowly got surer in my footing, I took in more of my surroundings. The forest is old, and dark, and deep. And the trees and plants seemed like they were trying to reach out and touch my arm, my legs, or hair. If David or someone didn't know where to go, we'd never get back home. I looked more closely at the trees, feeling like I kept seeing eyes opening and closing in the bark, bright brown and ochre-colored eyes. When I would glance back, they'd be leaves, or branches. I have such an active imagination, but I promise you though, that more than once, I heard my name being hummed by a bird, and heard trees moving throughout the forest. I glanced forward, hoping David would offer to walk alongside me, but he was focused and loudly complaining about his camera crackling and never turning on. He finally became so upset he threw the offending camera into the forest, causing me to call out, David, what the hell? Magpie, it's trash, it doesn't work, I'm not carrying it around with me anymore. I lost sight of the camera and was too afraid to step off the trail or too far from Rowan or Tippy to try and find the camera. It did make my stomach turn, especially when the forest became hushed in response to David's outburst. David continued on with a story about how he had discovered Puck and Tippy and brought them into his company as field photographers. They'll never let me capture them on camera though, but one day I will, I promise you. I'll have discovered the next Gigi Hadid with Tippy. For some reason, I reach out and grab Tippy's hand, giving it a squeeze and rolling my eyes behind David's back to her, indicating he's so full of it. Tippy glances down at our joined hands and gives me the most dazzling smile. She squeezed my hand gently before letting it go, as we reached our camp by this time. We started a fire and pulled out some ready-to-eat meals to eat. As we did this, David went back to the car to make another phone call, leaving me to gather firewood with Rowan. We fell into companionable silence as we gathered the wood and started the fire for dinner. As we settled in for the night, Tippy brought out an actual, cauldron-looking thing to set on a groove above the fire and began pouring in wine and some spices. Tippy, can I take your picture? You look like a very cottagecore tumbler witch right now. Tippy glanced over at me and laughed, before tilting her head like a bird, and saying, go ahead. I snapped a photo on my iPhone and showed it to her before David looked at my screen and grimaced in frustration. $700 camera and every picture she's in, she's blurred or just out of frame, but you get her picture perfect. That's because she likes me, I remarked dryly, tucking my phone back into my vest pocket, and rose to get some space. I had secreted more ingredients into my bag and brought them out to share with everyone. David disregarded them with a sneer, but Rowan, Puck and Tippy delighted in the ingredients. We spent the next part of the evening polishing off the s'mores materials, Rowan and Puck enjoying the marshmallows raw, while Tippy and I burnt ours black and charred. Rowan at one point leaned over and took his thumb to rub chocolate off my mouth, before sucking the chocolate from his thumb. I held my breath as he did so, and heard David clear his throat before slinging an arm over my shoulder again. That was when Tippy offered me the first cup of mulled wine. I don't know how to describe this taste. It was both refreshing, and coated my throat like melted chocolate. I was going to have to bug her to get the recipe for this. As we all sipped our mulled wine, David moved away again, to go back to the car and use his phone again. Rowan took his spot. He tilted his head, considering me. Rowan finally settled on asking me, "What do you want most in this realm, Magpie?" I answered with no time at all. "Kids. I can't wait to be a mom." I cover my mouth quickly, surprised by my own honesty to that question. Rowan nodded sagely and refilled my cup before moving out of David's seat again. That's when the fire began to dance and sway in rhythm with Tippy's voice, and the forest came alive and joined in our revelry. The trees swayed to and fro, with the fire quietly hissing and crackling as we sat around. My eyes started getting heavy, and I felt like I was more asleep than awake at points. I caught flashes of things that couldn't have been there, horns sprouting from Puck's back and his collarbone, Tippy, covered in a cascade of brown hawkish feathers, with her eyes bird-like and her beautiful hands talons. Rowan, with the tattoos covering the whole of his body and hardening almost like scales all over, his beautiful hands were dark red. His eyes now dark green never left my face as he spoke to Tippy and Puck. I felt like I was lucid dreaming, and wondered how to wake myself up from whatever this was. David appears in my periphery, and I can't speak, can't warn him away, can't move as I watch him walk over to the fire and sit next to them. The wine. Was it drugged? Why would they do that? I try to calm down and go to stand. I shoot up, far too fast, and my vision goes fuzzy with spots. David starts walking over to me, and before I can open my mouth to scream or grab a weapon, I feel the blow that puts me in the dirt. As I'm losing consciousness, I see Puck, Rowan, and Tippy come to stand behind David. It's a scream of terror that wakes me. I can feel a roaring fire now, and a cacophony of voices around me. I try not to move too much, before I realize I'm tied to a tree trunk, unable to move. As I'm trying not to panic, I feel a hand come up under my chin and lift it to look into dark forest green eyes. The hand that grasps my chin so gently is no longer human but scaled, smooth, and ends in very, very sharp claws. I hold my breath and don't fight the tilt, with my eyes coming up to meet Rowan's. I'm starting to shake, and it takes every logical fiber in my being not to scream when I look into Rowan's eyes. They're no longer human, with cat-like pupils that have narrowed into slits. He turns my head to the left, and then turns my head to the right. He hisses in vexation at my head wound. I notice his lack of dress. He's taken off his shirt and shoes, his feet ending in dragon-like toes, with wicked-looking talons on them. They looked like they bent backwards now. Rowan's beautiful jaw was more pointed, and out of his head grew bony horns that in sharpened points. He had more of these horns on his shoulders, at his elbows. He was broader now, the tattoos he had were moving around his skin, with the battle scenes actually happening across his torso, and the triskelion on his chest shimmering. He said nothing for a while, tilting my head to the left to get a better look at my injury. It was at this time I heard a spoon hitting the inside of a jar. My eyes landed on Tippy eating the honey I had brought by the spoonful, holding the jar right over her mouth to get the last golden drops out. She glanced over at me and her many-toothed mouth widened in something that mimicked a smile. "You're awake. Thank goodness, mortals are so delicate sometimes." She was now covered in what looked like downy feathers with flight feathers on her arms and back. Her colors were more muted than Rowan's. She was a gorgeous burnt umber and muted amber, almost perfectly matching the changing fall leaves on the trees that surrounded us. Camouflage flitted across my mind, before I remembered the situation I'm in. Tippy races forward preternaturally and comes right to my face, reaching up to draw a sharp claw down my face, drawing blood. Rowan seems to crowd her away from me, taking up more space in front of me. She hums and clicks from deep within her chest, then stands to walk back to the fire. I look back at Rowan. Rowan leans so close to me I think he's going to kiss me, before his tongue darts out from his mouth and he licks a long stripe up my cheek, coming away with a tongue full of blood. He closes his mouth and eyes in rapture, and I can hear this clicking noise rattling from somewhere inside him. I lean further into the tree while his arms trap me against the bark on both sides, as he leans his body close and licks a long stripe up my forehead again, cleaning my face of blood, and lessening the pain significantly. His scaled and tattooed chest crowd my face, and I'm overwhelmed by his presence, his scent. I try not to retch when I feel my stomach start to turn as his tongue probes around my head wound. His face is flecked with my blood now and it seems like he's got a taste for it. He slowly rises and says something guttural to Tippy. Tippy looks back at me and tips her head like a bird, evaluating whether a prey item is worth it. Tippy calls out for Puck, and he comes from the darkness, with blood all over him. He rubs his nose against Tippy's in an oddly human affectionate gesture and nods his head. "Ask," Rowan says, breaking me from my wool gathering. His face is passive. "Magpie. We know how smart you are. You've put it together, haven't you? Don't lie to me, I will know." It's Puck's name that should have given it away. The ability to navigate the forest with no trail, and David's broken camera all told the story. They're the Fae. Everything my grandmother ever told me was real. I feel like I can't breathe, as I mutter. "You're the Fae. And it's all real, isn't it?" Tippy crows in delight, and says, "What a clever offering David brings this harvest." None of the others could stop screaming to answer us. Sad. I look at Rowan again, feeling anger and betrayal begin to ebb, and my eyes begin to tear. Rowan tuts and coos to me, "None of that, little jackdaw, you passed our test with flying colors." I arch a brow at him, and he answers my unanswered query. "Every harvest moon, David brings us our tithe, in place of himself. Because we cannot offer up an innocent, we take them to a Hadasu and see whether your mortal greed outweighs your good sense. Usually it does, and they dig into the walls and take a Hadasu's tears. You didn't though. Why is that, Magpie? What makes you different from the others? It's been many that have tried taking things that never belonged to them." I shake my head a bit before hissing from the pain, at a loss for how to answer. Rowan's chest rattled again in an approximation of a laugh, as he grins at me, all teeth. "You see, I have thought of it. David has served his purpose. We already planned to sacrifice him. But you are unexpected. An innocent. We promised the forest 2 offerings this year though. This moon was going to be a spectacular harvest offering. Our lands would have twice the food, and feast for months on your bewitching bones. But you didn't take anything without asking. And I'm loath to break our rules now. What to do with you?" He purrs, "What would you do to live tonight? What would you have me do, to survive?" David found out quickly that taking pictures of things that don't belong to him without a tithe is not a smart way to survive. He offered to bring us other people to eat in his stead, and has done so for years. He'll be dealt with tonight. I look at him horrified and feel tears spring to my eyes at the bleakness of what's going on. I shove down those feelings, not having time for them at this moment. Rowan is still speaking to me, so I tune back in. Rowan continues, "But we knew eventually, he'd bring someone we liked more than him, and his deal wouldn't survive that person. So, Magpie. We took a vote, and it's unanimous. I'll offer you a different deal." David had been leading me on this whole time. He did pick me, just not for what I expected. I flush with shame and my stomach drops at the realization. My cheeks burn in humiliation as I try to keep from crying. Mortals are fickle, but the ones like you I like. Separates you from the animals like David. He reaches back out to feather his claw down my cheek tenderly. He brings his face close to mine. Rowan continues to watch me as I tremble. "So I will offer you a different deal. You will not be the sacrifice, but you will be a part of what we offer tonight. Join us to grant fertility to the forest, and dance under the moon with me." I could feel sweat beginning to gather at the base of my spine and run down the side of my face. Rowan sees me try to pull back, and takes issue with that, cupping my chin and demanding, "Open your eyes back up, Magpie. You cannot shy away from this. Will you join us, and survive? Or will you be weak and die? Which is it, Magpie?" A story comes uninvited into my head, about how to never make a deal with the fee, unless it's absolutely desperate. Make them specific if you have to make a deal, and finite. I hear another pained scream breach the air, causing Tippy to tip her head back and scream too, laughing all the while. "What do you want from me, Rowan?" Rowan smiles toothily and continues on. "You'll be my bean child tonight. You'll let me feed you, dance with you, and tie ribbons in your hair to celebrate the coming winter. Do this, and your life will be saved tonight. Doesn't sound so bad, does it? I'll do it." "Wonderful." Rowan yells and the roots that had previously held me pulled away in a gentle caress, and Rowan pulls me up to stand. Still woozy, he sets me in a fold-out chair to braid those ribbons through my tresses, being very careful with his clawed hands. Puck brings a brass bowl over to me, his chest making those rattling, pleased noises again. He tilts my head up and kisses me full on the lips, before he dips his finger into a bowl of dark ichor, traces a symbol on both cheeks, and my forehead. Rowan lifts me again, with Puck backing away smiling, as Tippy steps forward now, and kisses me full on the lips, just as Puck did. "Open up, or I'll make you open up," she says so demurely, as though she's asking me the time. I reluctantly open my mouth and she put 2 leaves in my mouth. Holly for rebirth, and Rowan for protection. Swallow. I chew furiously, scrunching my face before I choke the bits down. Tippy pushes my head back and brings a cup to my lips, as this liquid breaches my mouth and I'm forced to swallow. Her face passive, she glances at me approvingly. Rowan then steps in front of me, and takes my hand now, leading me to where the screams are. The faces in the trees came out again, each tree with weeping eyes, or curling grins, and watching us or me, so carefully. It's not just them, there are others. Other creatures, all different but similar in shape, come out from behind trees as they watch me. I know I'm a lamb up for the offer and try to curl into Rowan's side and make myself as small as possible. I'm clenching my hands so hard they start to go numb, but I can't bring myself to loosen up. Rowan looks over at me, and shushes, "Be calm. I already told you no harm will come to you. The forest knows its time, and it grows restless. The revelries can only wait so long." He brings me in front of a large oak tree, with what looks like a mass of gnarled bark in the center. Until I realize it's not bark, it's human skin, and that this is where David has been this whole time. The brutality of what's been done to him is artful, in a way. He's naked, and he's had twigs, branches, and vines threaded through his skin and arms. Very thin and delicately racing up his arms and his veins, bulging out in places. Branches have been plunged into his skull to look like horns. Puck is standing in front of him, admiring his work as he turns to greet us. The pained screams were coming from him. If I look too closely at him, I can watch the vines moving under his skin as they do God knows what to him. That's when I feel Rowan let go of my hand and place a wicked-looking piece of obsidian in my hand. I narrow my eyes. What is this? Tonight will be very special. Part of this trade is you taking his life. This is my second gift to you. Take this and begin the feast. You must do this, sweetling, it's the only way to keep you safe. I feel his arms band around me, leading my hand to David. I don't stop to think and drag the dagger across David's throat. It is not easy, and it is not neat. The cut is ragged and jerky, and David begins choking. Rowan steps around me and grins, slashing at David's exposed stomach to catch at his innards. Not to eat, just to cause pain. I try to back away and hit a hard chest behind me, whirling around to see Puck, with his bright white eyes and his chitinous body. His mouth pulls up the corners and he set me aside. He, Tippy and Rowan call out and join the feast. Rowan looks at me with something closing in on pride, before he leans down and bites down on David's face. David's still alive when they begin to eat. Rowan pays interest to his face, biting his tongue and ears off, while Tippy and Puck begin in the middle, ripping him open before they pull out his liver. Puck offers it to Tippy the way one would offer a bouquet of flowers. I'm frozen, and I can't move, and I realize then that I'm surrounded by a feeding frenzy. I back up against a tree, unable to look away. The three begin laughing and throwing their heads back and making calls that are responded to in kind by what sounds like several other groups, doing the same thing. I hear screams and moans of pain being carried in the wind. I hope to slip away while they're distracted, as more fee pour out of the forest in all shapes and sizes. Some clothed, most naked. Plenty covered in viscera. Rowan finds me, his hands, covered in viscera, come up and cup my face, before he leans down and presses his lips against my mouth in a pantomime of a kiss. He pulls back and murmurs, "Let me feed you now." He forces my jaw open as he pushes something in his mouth to mine, and tells me to swallow. I gag and swallow. I'm certain it's bits of David, as he coos and praises me for doing such a good job. Rowan tilts my chin up and says if I vomit, I have to eat it again. I swallow, grunt in exertion and finally cry out, as Rowan smooths my hair away from my face. Please, please just let me go home. Please. I look for something, anything in his face when I plead for help. Rowan leans down, kissing me again. A promise is a promise, magpie. He's smiling and seems so pleased with himself. He takes me to the fire, and roars something aloud to the crowd. Every face turns to stare at me, and I feel very exposed. Some look on with hunger, some curiosity, and some with weariness. They all begin to rattle deep within their chest, a chorus that makes everything hazy around me. Rowan turns me and takes me in a dance around the bonfire, so many faces and feet clapping their hands and celebrating. I look behind him to see the trees come alive and take part in the feast of David, the forest rejoicing in the spilling of blood. The last thing I see before I faint is Rowan, telling me he has such great plans for me. I wake up to a forest ranger calling my name, flashing a light in and around my eyes. Hello. My head hurts worse than it did the night before, my whole body hurts. Thank God we found you. You have some worried friends and family, Mississippi. How, what happened? I'm going to let the officers tell you about that. We need to get you out of here and home safe. This is a crime scene now, we'd best not disturb it. The voices of the ranger drift off, as I see that the former campsite is surrounded by EMTs, forest rangers, even FBI and state police. David had been a suspect in the murders of missing women for quite some time, I found out. I'm number 33 in a list of victims. Rowan's voice pops back up in my head. What makes you so different, Magpie? I still don't know the answer to that question. The next few hours pass in a blur. I have my wounds cleaned, and my clothes gathered as evidence. I'm sent home in a borrowed pair of scrubs, as my clothes are pieces of evidence now. And it isn't until I'm allowed to be taken home by a friend that I realize something. I had been spinning a ring around on my ring finger to fidget with and looked down at it. On my ring finger is Rowan's gold signet ring. My stomach drops when I see this, and I look up at my friend Maya then. She sees my face crack like an egg as I start bawling, deep guttural cries leaving me as she hugs me as tight as she can in the front seat of her car, just sitting with me until I can breathe again. Maya stays with me the first night, and Tony comes over the next. They fret over me, call work and explain my absence. I insist on changing the locks. Locks won't be enough to keep Rowan out. If he really wants to get in, nothing will. But it gives me some perverse peace of mind. They're lovely, and caring, and have no idea how to comfort me at this time. I know that as days pass, I'm being watched. I catch it with the scent of pine needles and honey on the breeze, or when I see a perfect replica of one of Rowan's tattoos appear on the cover of a book. I can't bring myself to tell anyone what happened. David won't be the thing that breaks me. Rowan? The fee? I'm not so sure. After 3 weeks, the dreams begin. Vivid dreams, or memories from that horrible night, of the fee singing, and ribbons binding Rowan and I's hands. Of Rowan putting his ring on my finger, of me having a cup full of blood brought to my lips and imbibing from it. The dreams progress, the most intense one, being one in which I'm heavily pregnant, with Rowan stroking my pregnant belly lovingly. He leans down and kisses my womb, before he looks up adoringly before I feel something moving around underneath my skin. I dream labor begins and a baby comes forth, scaled and terrible and beautiful, and comes screaming into the world. Rowan leans down and bites the umbilical cord, before handing our child to his sister as he insists on cleaning me up and healing my injuries. I can feel myself fading away, watching my baby be fed a red milky substance, Tippy cooing down lovingly at my baby. I wake up screaming and sweating, and nausea wins out against me. I barely make it to the bathroom, emptying my stomach. I sit in a corner curled up by the toilet for a bit, grounding myself. It's just a dream. It's just dreams. They're just dreaming processing trauma. I can't fall back asleep though, as I think of how nauseous I've been the past 3 weeks. My mood's been swinging back and forth. Dread curls around the base of my spine, as I know what it is I'm denying. I don't believe it until I have 3 positive pregnancy tests in front of me, though. I stare at them angrily, wanting them to not be true, rubbing my stomach absently. I call Maya, telling her I need to talk and put the tests in my bag before opening up my front door. And down on the front step is a jar of candied ginger and thermos. I already know who left these. On the jar of candied ginger is a note that reads, "For the nausea I see you having," and on the thermos, the note reads, "Drink me," almost like an Alice in Wonderland tag. Enough, I decide. I step out into my backyard and call out, "Rowan. You must be here if you're watching me. Come out and tell me what's going on." Rowan just comes forward, peeling himself away from the trees surrounding my property like early morning fog rolling in. He's human-looking, mostly. He's got this lazy, satisfied grin on his face, his hand going to my womb proprietarily. "Magpie, our offering worked. You're the fertility of the forest being given back to us. This," he pointedly indicates to my womb dash, "is the first pregnancy of the fee in quite some time." "Why the blood, whose is it?" Rowan grinned and shook his head, murmuring, "I'll divulge every detail about who that blood was if you'd like, but I strongly suspect that you won't, Magpie. It's for the baby. You'll start to feel it too, when your thirst can't be quenched. I will bring you gifts every week at first, until you're farther along, and you must eat solids." I turn green at the mention of solids, and a bit lightheaded. I'm near a panic, as he comes close and shushes me, cupping my face far too intimately. "You said all you wanted in this world was a family. That you wanted to be a mother. You brought us honey and gifts, and the forest chose you. This is your gift. It will be a child of both peoples, and it belongs to you. For a time. I know from everything I've read, rejecting a gift is usually an atrocious idea with the Fae. I stop and try to rethink what it is I want to say, but don't get the chance." Rowan looks around and seems to listen to the breeze, before he leans down and pecks me gently on the lips. "I must leave now. Drink what I have left you, pet. I will take care of you and make sure you have everything you need for our child." Rowan looks at me hard, then. "Magpie, I will always find you. I will always know where you are, and I will always come for you. Do not think of running or disappearing. I will always find you. And the ones who hide, always regret it." As he says this, figures peel off the forest and show themselves. Faced with all terrible shapes and sizes, all watching me with curious looks in their eyes, before they melt back into the forest, leaving me standing alone again. It's the whole Fae folk watching over me then. As the forest settles back down again, I walk back inside my house, dropping my purse by my back door. I looked at the thermos I had left and put a kettle on for tea. As I wait for the water to boil and contemplate the 8 ounces of blood in front of me, I find myself rubbing up and down my stomach already, trying not to get too excited. A baby. A baby of my own. A chance to set down roots, and pass on legacies, and stories of our own. The more I think of this, the more I yearn and hunger for it. I can feel the gnaw begin, as I stroke my stomach absently, setting my bag down. I'm no longer interested in what Maya may have to say about this. I am very thirsty though. I set the tea bag in the hot water and watch it steep. I add sugar and milk and unscrew the top of the thermos gingerly. The blood looks thick and dark, and I tip it slowly over into my teacup, adding a considerable amount. I bring the cup to my lips and drink. Fourth story. This story was shared Vengeful Kenny. There is something evil in the woods. It all started 2 months ago and I can't keep it to myself any longer. My friends and family listened to me with interest at the beginning, but by now they roll their eyes and grow impatient when I bring up the thing living in the woods. I'll give some context and then try my best to describe the horrors that have been unfolding. I live right on the edge of an enormous forest, and I mean it when I say it is huge. The number of endangered species that live in these woods means that nobody can build or live in it, and hiking off the trails is strictly prohibited. Although the forest is miles and miles deep, if you want to follow the law then you are restricted to a trail that follows the edge of the forest and hardly shows you anything. It is also known that Native Americans used to live in these woods, and hikers happen across arrowheads there sometimes. Well, lately I've been going through a bad breakup and spending a lot of time alone for a change. I've found that the only way I can truly forget my problems and my depression for a little while is to hike in the woods and explore. I had been leaving my house with a backpack loaded with some snacks and water, as well as my knife and a joint to smoke. Like I said, my house is a little isolated and right on the edge of the woods, so I walk about 200 yards and I am there. Lately I had made a habit of heading off the trail and directly into the woods, going slightly deeper with each hike. I rarely saw anyone on the trail in the first place, so I wasn't worried about getting caught off the trail by anybody, plus I have survival experience in case anything happened. It helped me put things in perspective to be out in nature alone, plus sometimes I would happen across a really great view or something cool like an old chair or an ancient can of beans. So this day is no different. I left my house with my backpack and headed to the forest. It didn't take long until I was off the trail and heading deep into the woods. The sun was out, but the trees are so tall and thick that it seems dark even on a bright day. A couple rays of sunshine managed to break through the canopy of branches and leaves, providing a nice contrast to the dark stillness of the forest below. I took in the sights and walked through the woods almost entirely through mechanical instinct. My mind was miles away, focused on my troubles and how upset I was about life at that moment. I was in a dark place that day and even hiking wasn't breaking me out of it. I think being so mentally distracted is what led me to hike further than I ever intended to, and way further than I had ever gone before. I might have even taken several wrong turns from my usual landmarks, I don't even know. All I know is what happened soon after. I had been walking for at least another 45 minutes or an hour before I consciously realized that I was lost. I usually followed a creek or looked at the mountains in the distance for reference, but at this point I was actually at the base of the mountain. It stood before me, craggy and barren with less trees and more rocks the further you climbed. It was the first mountain of the mountain range, and behind me was the dense and dark forest. I cursed myself for hiking this far in a daze, because judging from the sun I only had about an hour of good sunlight left in the day before the woods started getting really creepy. Quickly I decided to get a vantage point on the mountain so that I could see which way was home. I found a nice overlook a little ways above the tree line and found the direction I needed to head back in. This calmed my nerves a bit and I decided it was a good spot to take a break. I gulped down a bottle of water and ate some snacks as I admired the view. I loved how the tops of the trees stretched as far as the eye could see, hiding everything going on below. It was the humbling perspective I was looking for. I began smoking a joint before heading back, feeling my buzz get stronger as I scanned the horizon aimlessly. I was nearly done with the joint when my eyes settled on what looked like the biggest cat I had ever seen in my life wandering around in the clearing, just 40 feet down where I had just come from. Being high, it took me a moment to realize I was looking at a mountain lion that was easily the size of a large dog or bigger. My blood ran cold. The second my fear kicked in, it's like this animal sensed it. It peered up at where I was sitting from below and promptly darted out of sight, exactly towards where I had been able to climb up from. At this point I am freaking the hell out. I knew that thing was coming to get me. I felt it in my gut that I was now being hunted. If you have ever felt this kind of fear, it is the most overwhelming, panicky feeling you will ever have. Time moves slowly, but at the same time your mind is freaking out and it is very easy to slip up and make a mistake. I grabbed my backpack, leaving behind all of my trash and snacks, and immediately begin running down mountain from the side opposite where I came from. I know I slipped at least twice from my busted knees and the chunk missing from my left palm, but at the moment I was feeling no pain and was entirely focused on getting home as fast as possible. I got down that hillside faster than I had ever moved before in my life. I truly wish I could end my story here and have it just be about a mountain lion. I really do. But when I reached the bottom of the mountain and was ready to haul ass in the direction of home, I got the most evil and horrible feeling that I was being watched. I ignored every instinct to run away and decided to look behind me. What I saw haunts me. About 40 or so feet up the mountainside, at the exact spot I was smoking and eating at moments ago, stands an old Native American man. Even from where I am standing I can see his rugged, bark-colored skin and his unkempt silver hair. He is wearing a robe of what appears to be animal skins adorned with feathers, like someone from a different era. I notice that he is staring directly at me, and he is very, very mad. There were tears running down his face, but his eyes were unblinking and fixated on me in a complete rage. I have never seen such evil and hatred in my entire life. His eyes were bugging out of his face and his mouth was fixed in a horrible grimace. His arms were stuck at his sides, but his shoulders were shaking violently, his entire body rocking in place. And he was angry, and staring directly at me. Staring at this person seemed like an eternity, even though it was probably just 5 seconds in reality. I turned and bolted. I was completely terrified. I was tearing through the woods, getting cut up by branches when I heard a horrifying screech/scream just a short ways behind me. It sounded like a beast and a human at the same time, as well as sounded completely angry yet sad at the same time. I was losing my mind with fear. I was ready at any moment to die some sort of horrible fate. I had no idea what was after me at this point or what was going to happen. And then I heard another scream, even angrier and louder than before. I'm not proud to admit that I shat my pants during all of this. I am running like an Olympic athlete through the woods at this point. I hardly even remember how long I was running, but eventually I broke through the woods and found myself on a country road that I knew was several miles from my home. It was nearly completely dark now. Being on the road didn't satisfy me, as I kept running down the road, putting distance between me and the forest. As I ran, I managed to get phone out and clumsily dial the closest person in my contacts list, my neighbor Phil. Hello. Hey Phil, I'm really in a bit of an emergency and was wondering if you could pick me up at the road I was on. I'd really appreciate you. Also, could you bring a gun just in case? The comment about the gun seemed to really put him on edge. Wait, why? What's going on? It's nothing. I just think there might be a large animal or a predator out here and it's getting dark. Phil seemed to get the urgency because I heard his truck door slam while he agreed to come pick me up. I thanked him sincerely and stayed on the phone with him while I waited for him to get there. It felt like an eternity, but soon enough his truck pulled up and I hopped inside. Phil seemed both wary and irritated that I had him rush out to pick me up, but I couldn't care less. I was just thankful to be heading home at that point. Phil quickly seemed to realize that I had defecated myself, but had the decency to not say anything. He asked me what the hell happened and why I was such a bloody mess. I told him that I was hiking and got stalked by a mountain lion and fled, as he nodded in understanding. But once I mentioned that I thought I saw an old Native American man, the energy in the vehicle completely changed. I could practically feel Phil's arm hairs raise. "Have you ever seen anyone like that around here?" I asked him. He paused before replying, as if chewing on his words before deciding what to say. "No, but I don't think you should go out that ways ever again. You're asking for trouble." The car fell silent right as I realized we were pulling up to my house. I thanked Phil again and said goodnight as I shut the truck door and started walking up my driveway. My house is rather isolated, so there are no street lights or neighbors close by, and I hadn't turned on my porch lights before leaving. Thankfully it was a full moon and my driveway and lawn were illuminated in a soft nocturnal glow. It had surprising visibility, partly due to the moon and partly because I had been outside as it grew dark. I had all but forgotten about what happened in the woods. My mind could only focus on how happy I was to be safe and home. I walked through my front door and gave one last look outside and saw him. The old Native American man was standing at the foot of my driveway. It was night, but I immediately knew it was him, from the body shape and from the angry, almost demonic body and shoulder swaying. "Holy shit!" I yell as I slam the door, triple lock it, and run to my room on the second floor. I locked my bedroom door, grabbed my gun from the nightstand, and locked myself in the bathroom closet. I laid there panting and seizing with my gun pointed at the door for what might have actually been hours until I somehow fell asleep. I woke up the next morning feeling immediate anxiety and fear. My body was covered in dried blood and scratches from the night before, and my loaded gun lay next to me on the floor. I picked it up and reluctantly did a sweep of the entire house, feeling like I was being watched the entire time. Even when I searched every room I felt like I couldn't relax, so I decided to look around outside of the house. What I found horrifies me. There were claw marks about 3 feet off the ground on both the front door and the back door. Something monstrous had tried getting in last night. I just hadn't heard because I was on the second story locked in the closet. I really have no explanation for what I experienced, but things have actually been getting freakier since then. About 2 weeks later I began finding dead animals in front of the door when I came home. At first it was just a squirrel here or there, but the last animal that was left was a cat. Weirdest part is that there are no wounds or blood on the corpse, they just show up dead, like their necks were snapped or they were poisoned. I'm thoroughly freaked out and have thought about calling the police, but without any evidence they couldn't do anything. I also live in an isolated forest area, so even if I asked them to patrol by my house it would be unrealistic. I've even considered selling my home and moving, but I can't bring myself to simply uproot like that. I've been trying to research the forest's history and whether any crimes have occurred or people have gone missing, but I haven't found anything. Even trying to talk to friends and family is fruitless since they think I'm losing my mind once I mention to Native American man. There is one friend I talk to who believes me, but he wants to go with me back to the spot and try to confront this thing/person. This idea terrifies me, but I feel like I must do something. The bodies are showing up more and more frequently and I feel like it's only going to get worse. Fifth story. This story was shared Strange Days 79. North Maine Woods. This incident was the most terrifying experience of my life. This happened in the fall of 1982 in Baxter State Park, Maine. I lived in Manchester, New Hampshire at the time and desperately wanted to get one last camping trip in before the weather changed and the region would become buried in snow and tourists from out of state for the skiing season. It was early November, and it was still warm during the day and nice and chilly at night. Perfect for sitting around the fire and relaxing. I loved the outdoors, I still do, but the events of that night in Maine would leave a mark on me for the rest of my life. My wife worked all weekend at the hospital downtown, and both the kids were at Grandma and Grandpa's for the weekend. I called in sick to work, loaded up my Bronco, strapped the canoe on the roof, and hit the interstate. I was on the water late in the afternoon. I loved this area because of how remote it was. I was few miles from my launch site, where the truck was parked, when I spotted a perfect place to camp. I paddled toward the shore. This is a great spot, I thought to myself. I set up my little tent, built a fire, and unfolded my pack chair to relax. The day turned into night, and I crashed out in the tent. The following day I awoke to the sounds of birds chirping. It was a little cooler but still great weather. I took my camera out into the forest to take some pictures. I did some fishing and just enjoyed the peaceful stillness of this remote wilderness. The day was uneventful, and soon after dinner, I lay in my tent with my flashlight reading. I must have dozed off because I awoke startled by something moving outside my tent. I lay still, but instinct told me there was something outside. I could hear the carefully placed steps of something. There are moose and black bear up here. Moose can be very dangerous if you walk upon them by surprise. The bears generally smell you before you see them and keep away. I lay still and listened. Whatever it was had stopped at the entrance flap of the tent. As my eyes adjusted to the darkness, I could make out a faint shadowy shape. I was wide awake now and on full alert. Whatever it was, I could hear it sniffing around and the panting of breath. I slowly began to unzip the tent when it ran off. I unzipped the flap of my tent and looked out just in time to see the branches swaying and hear the sound of something moving through the brush and into the deep woods. The sound of its footfalls told me one important thing: it was on two legs. That couldn't be right. I hadn't seen any other people since entering the park and leaving my truck at the trailhead. The tourist season for leaf peepers had passed, and even so, someone could only reach this location by the waterway. I suppose someone could be out here, someone I hadn't seen or heard until they came sniffing and snorting around my campsite in the middle of the night. I guess it was possible. As the sun rose, I ate my breakfast but remained on guard. I couldn't shake the feeling of being watched. I felt a presence in the forest. Someone or something, just out of sight. I kept a .45 revolver when I camped out here in the North Woods. I wasn't concerned about the wildlife so much as the weirdos you might run across, the meth heads, the backcountry types. In my experience, the scariest thing you can come across when you're alone in the deep woods is another human. I couldn't be sure if someone were out there, but the paranoia had begun to take hold. It was dark now, and I was inside my tent. I kept the revolver close and my boots on. I was done playing games. I sure didn't plan on shooting anyone, but I was damn sure to show them I was no easy target. I sat up quickly. I must have fallen asleep again because I was startled awake by movement all around the tent. The shadows everywhere, on all sides, in all directions. I could hear sniffing and snorting, low grunting, and raspy breathing. What the hell is happening? I thought in a panic. It didn't sound like people, but the height of the shadows cast against the flaps of the tent in the moonlight revealed prominent, upright figures. There must have been 5 or maybe 6 on all sides. Fear gripped me as the realization came over me. I was surrounded. The low growling stared. It was answered back on the other side and all around me. Low, deliberate growling. Were these coyotes? Were the massive shadows just the light playing tricks on me? The growling increased in pitch and intensified, and I knew an attack was imminent. I pulled my revolver and fired straight up in the air. The next moments were a complete blur. I charged through the tent with just the clothes on my back, my .45, and the truck keys in my pocket. I bolted straight for the canoe and muscled it into the water. I jumped in and began paddling. I never looked back until I got far enough from the shore. I should have never looked back. They were standing completely still on the riverbank. Their bodies crouched down, with heads low, eyes reflecting in the moonlight. They looked like giant coyotes or maybe even wolves, 6 in total. I was transfixed by what I was seeing. I had never seen a coyote this large, this massive. As I sat in the safety of my little canoe studying these creatures, they did something I will never forget. They began to stand up on their hind legs. Each one would slowly raise to 2 legs. I couldn't believe what I was seeing. They all stood like men. These things. These creatures that had almost ambushed me as their prey. I turned and furiously paddled as the howling rang out behind me. Thanks a lot for watching the video till the end. Subscribe to our channel Horror in Detail. Drop your opinions/suggestions in the comments section, and like the video as it helps with the YouTube algorithm.